The auctioneer's voice is a rusty hammer, pounding the dry, dusty air of Redemption Gulch into submission. It rings off the false fronts of the mercantile and the saloon, scattering the chickens pecking in the street. Silas Blackwood feels each syllable like a stone against his ribs. He keeps his hat low, his shoulders hunched against the gazes of his neighbors. They all know why he's here. His fences are down, his north pasture is fallow, and the bank is circling like a patient buzzard. He needs a draft horse, a strong back to pull his plow and haul timber, and he needs it for a price that won't break him completely. The auctioneer, a portly man named Blevins with a sweat-stained collar, is currently selling off the last pathetic remnants of the Thorne homestead. Jedediah Thorne had been a mean drunk with a penchant for bad investments, and his death left behind nothing but debt and debris. A chipped wash basin goes for a nickel, a three-legged stool for 2 cents. Silas waits, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the sturdy Belgian gelding tied to a post, occasionally stamping a heavy, placid hoof. That horse is his last hope. And now, Blevins bellows, wiping his brow with a grimy handkerchief. The final lot from the Thorne estate. 1 indenture contract, fully transferable, with 4 years remaining. For the girl, Elara. A murmur ripples through the small crowd. Silas's gaze shifts reluctantly. They shove her forward from the side of the auction block. She is small, younger than he'd thought, maybe 19. Her dress is a collection of faded patches, her hair a tangled mess of sun-bleached brown, and there's a smudge of dirt high on one cheekbone. She stumbles but catches herself, her spine straightening with a defiance that seems too big for her slight frame. Her eyes, a startling shade of moss green, sweep over the leering, appraising faces. They are eyes that have seen too much and expect nothing. A strong worker, Blevins proclaims, giving her a rough shove on the shoulder that makes her stagger. Good for mending, cooking, cleaning, and field work when needed. Docile and requires little keep. What am I bid for 4 years of guaranteed labor? Let's start the bidding at $20. Silence. $20 could buy a man a good sow and a month's worth of flour. A few men snicker. One calls out, "I'll give you $1, Blevins, if she warms my bed." A round of coarse laughter follows. Elara flinches, her chin dipping for a fraction of a second before she forces it back up, her gaze now fixed on the distant, hazy mountains. She is trying to remove herself from her own skin. Silas feels a cold knot of disgust tighten in his gut. He has seen cattle treated with more dignity. He turns his attention back to the horse, trying to block out the girl's silent humiliation. The horse is practical. The horse is survival. $10, someone finally bids. It's Miller, who runs the smithy and is known for his heavy hand. 12, counters a rancher from the South Ridge. The bidding is sluggish, insulting. They are bartering for a human soul with pocket change. Silas clenches his fists, the worn leather of his gloves creaking. He thinks of his own solitary cabin, the silence that has screamed at him since Martha passed. He thinks of the sheer, grinding loneliness of his life. It is an ache he has learned to carry, but seeing this girl, this child, being sold like a sack of grain makes his own quiet suffering feel like a luxury. Blevins is about to bring the gavel down for $15 to Miller when the girl's head snaps around. Her eyes, desperate and sharp, lock onto Silas. He doesn't know why. Maybe it's because he isn't laughing. Maybe it's because he looks as broken as she feels. Her lips part, and a voice, raspy from disuse but clear as a bell in the sudden lull, cuts through the air. "Rancher," she says, her gaze boring into him. "Skip the horse." The crowd turns to stare at her, then at Silas. Blevins's face purples with rage at the interruption. "Take me," she continues, her voice gaining a desperate strength. Every word is a gamble, her last coin thrown onto the table. "I'll work harder than any horse. I'll cook, I'll clean, I'll mend, I'll plow if you teach me. No pay, just a roof and food. I'll be yours eternal." They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The phrase hangs in the air, shocking in its raw honesty. Yours eternal. It is a vow of absolute servitude, a plea from the bottom of a deep, dark well. It is the sound of a soul surrendering everything for a single chance at something other than cruelty. Miller snorts. She's got spirit, I'll give her that. Blevins raises his gavel. Girl, you'll be silent or you'll feel the back of my hand. The bid stands at 15. Silas moves. He doesn't think. He acts. A feeling, something hot and protective he hasn't felt in 3 long years, surges through him. He takes 2 steps forward, into the small clearing around the auction block. $16, he says, his voice a low growl. The crowd goes dead silent. All eyes are on him. Miller, the smithy, glares at him, surprised. Blevins looks down, his piggy eyes gleaming with sudden interest. $16 from Mr. Blackwood, he crows. Do I hear 17? Miller hesitates, looking from Silas's grim, set face to the girl's. He shrugs. He can have the scrawny thing. $16 going once, going twice. Blevins scans the crowd, a showman milking the moment. He points his gavel at Silas. Sold. To the struggling rancher, for a girl instead of a horse. And with a single nod that cost him nearly everything he had, Silas Blackwood's life, and hers, were irrevocably changed. The transaction had been a grim, silent affair. Blevins counted Silas's worn bills twice before handing over a folded, yellow document that felt like a sin to hold. Alara had stood by, unmoving, her eyes downcast, as if the moment her gaze had met his had spent the last of her courage. The walk away from the auction block was a gauntlet of whispers and stares. Lost his mind, that one. He heard a woman mutter to her husband. Buying a stray when his own roof is leaking. Cheaper than a wife, I suppose, another man chuckled. Silas ignored them, his hand resting lightly on the small of Alara's back to guide her toward his wagon. She flinched at the contact, a tremor running through her thin frame, and he immediately dropped his hand as if he'd been burned. He hadn't touched another person with any intent, kind or otherwise, since he'd held Martha's hand as her breathing grew shallow. The memory was a fresh lance of pain. What in God's name had he done? He helped her onto the wagon seat, his movements stiff and awkward. She scrambled up without a word, pulling her patched skirt tight around her ankles and staring straight ahead at the rump of his old mare, Bess. The journey back to his ranch was a long, slow crawl into the foothills of the granite mountains that clawed at the sky. The silence in the wagon was heavier than a winter snowdrift, thick with unspoken questions and fears. He risked a sideways glance at her. Up close, she looked even younger, the hard lines of her life etched around her eyes and mouth. Her hands were raw and calloused, knuckles scraped and red. She was a thing made of wire and grit, and he had just paid $16 for her. The thought soured in his stomach. He hadn't bought a person. He had intervened. He had stopped something ugly. That's what he told himself. But the folded paper in his pocket felt like a brand. His ranch was little more than a scar on the vast landscape. A small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands, a leaning barn, and a few corrals were all that broke the endless sweep of sagebrush and prairie grass. To him, it had once been a kingdom of hope. Now, it was just a place to work until he was too tired to think. When he pulled the wagon to a stop, the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. For a long moment, they both just sat, listening to the wind sigh through the pines. This is it, he said finally, his voice hoarse. She slid down from the wagon before he could offer a hand, landing silently on the hard-packed earth. She stood and looked at the cabin, her expression unreadable. He expected fear, maybe disappointment. Instead, she seemed to be measuring it, assessing it. He led the way inside. The cabin was one room, dominated by a stone fireplace. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the middle, a sturdy bed was pushed against one wall, and shelves holding a few tins of beans and sacks of flour lined another. It was sparse, but it was clean. Martha had insisted on clean. There's a cot in the lean-to, he said, gesturing to a narrow door at the back. It's dry. You can sleep there. She gave a short, jerky nod, her eyes darting around the room, taking everything in. He felt a sudden, sharp need to explain. The arrangement, he started, fumbling for words. You work. I provide food and a roof. That's all. You understand. He was trying to reassure her, to tell her she was safe from the kind of advances she'd likely endured before. I understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'll be yours eternal. She said it again, that strange, solemn vow. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact, the terms of her existence as she knew them. He didn't know how to respond to it, so he just grunted and turned away, busying himself with the fire. He'd expected her to be timid, to wait for orders. He was wrong. While he saw to the mare, she found the water pump and, after a moment of struggling with the stiff handle, filled the basin by the door. She washed her face and hands, the movements methodical and efficient. Then, without a word, she spotted his mending basket, overflowing with work shirts and torn trousers. She picked it up, sat in the chair he wasn't using, and threaded a needle with an economy of motion that spoke of endless practice. He watched her from the corner of his eye as he prepared a meager supper of beans and bacon. The only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the fire and the whisper-soft shush of her needle passing through worn denim. The silence felt different now, less empty. It was occupied by this small, quiet person who was already trying to earn her keep, to prove the value of his $16 gamble. When he placed a plate of food on the table in front of her, she started, as if surprised he'd thought to feed her. She looked from the plate to his face, her green eyes wide and searching. "Thank you," she murmured, and it was the first time she had looked at him without a mask of pure desperation. For a fleeting second, he saw not an indenture, but just a girl. A tired, hungry girl a long way from home. Later that night, long after she had retired to the cot in the lean-to, Silas sat by the dying fire, the indenture contract spread on the table before him. He read the cruel, legalistic words that bound Alara to 4 more years of servitude. He thought of the horse he hadn't bought, the plow that would remain idle, the mounting debt that threatened to swallow him whole. Then he looked at the shirt she had mended, draped over the back of her chair. The stitches were tiny, neat, and far stronger than the original seam. An act of care in a world that had shown her none. He picked up the contract, crumpled it into a tight ball, and tossed it into the glowing embers of the fire. He watched as the edges curled, blackened, and turned to ash. Whatever this arrangement was, it would not be defined by that piece of paper. It would be defined by something else. He just didn't know what yet. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the endless demands of the land. Alara was a tireless worker, rising before he did to stoke the fire and put coffee on to boil. She moved about the cabin with a quiet efficiency that was almost ghostly, never speaking unless spoken to, her eyes always watchful. She was trying to make herself indispensable, to prove her vow. She weeded the neglected vegetable patch with a fierce determination, her small frame bent over the soil for hours. She scrubbed the cabin floors until the pine boards shone. She learned the temperament of his half-dozen chickens and soon had them laying more regularly than they had in months. Silas found himself watching her, a strange mix of admiration and unease stirring within him. He had brought her here out of a moment's defiant compassion, but he hadn't considered the reality of sharing his space, his life, with a stranger, especially a stranger to whom he was, by law and circumstance, a master. The role fit him as poorly as a suit made for another man. He tried to keep a distance, to maintain the boundaries of their arrangement. He worked the fence line on the far side of the property, felling timber and splitting rails until his muscles screamed and his hands were raw, even through his gloves. It was hard, grueling work meant for 2 men or 1 man with a good horse. The absence of the Belgian he'd failed to buy was a constant, aching reminder of his precarious situation. One afternoon, he returned to the cabin, exhausted and grim, to find the aroma of stew filling the air. Alara stood at the hearth, stirring a pot. She had found wild onions and late-season carrots, combining them with the last of their salted pork. It was the most flavorful meal he'd had in years. They ate in their usual silence, but it felt less strained. As he ate, he noticed a book lying on the small shelf by the fireplace that hadn't been there before. It was his late wife's copy of Emerson's essays, its leather cover worn smooth. "You read?" he asked, the question abrupt in the quiet room. She looked up, startled, a flicker of fear in her eyes, as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. "A little, sir. My mother taught me, before." She didn't elaborate on the before, and he didn't ask. The sir grated on him. "My name is Silas," he said gruffly. She ducked her head. "Yes, sir. Silas." The next evening, he returned from his work to find her sitting by the fire, the book open in her lap. She wasn't reading it so much as looking at the words, her finger tracing a line of text. She looked up when he entered, a flush rising on her cheeks as she quickly closed the book and set it aside. A silent apology for a transgression she hadn't committed. That night, Silas made a decision. He pulled out the heavy, leather-bound family Bible, the only other book he owned. He opened it to the first page, where the names of his parents and grandparents were written in faded ink. Below them, his own name, and beside it, Martha's. There was so much empty space below. He slid the heavy book across the table to her. "You should practice," he said, not meeting her eyes. "No use in a skill going to waste." Her head shot up, her green eyes wide with disbelief. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched the cover of the Bible as if it were a holy relic. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of something other than fear or gratitude. It was a fragile, hesitant flicker of trust. That trust was tested a week later. A rider approached the ranch, and Silas recognized the swagger even from a distance. It was Gus Miller, the smithy who had bid on Alara. He reined in his horse near the corral where Silas was trying to repair a gate with substandard wire. "Blackwood," Miller greeted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Silas's boot. "Heard you were putting in a new fence line. Could use a hand, if you're looking for day work." It was a thinly veiled excuse. Miller's eyes kept straying to the cabin, where Alara was hanging laundry on a line. "Heard you got yourself some help," he continued, a sly grin spreading across his face. "That little thing from the auction. She earning her keep." Silas's hands tightened on the wire cutters. "She is." "Figured as much," Miller chuckled, his gaze lingering on Alara's form. "If you ever get tired of her, or feel like sharing the workload, you know where to find me. I'd still pay a fair price." A cold, white-hot rage, sharp and clean, shot through Silas. It was the same feeling he'd had at the auction block. He dropped the cutters and turned to face Miller fully. His voice was dangerously quiet. "This is my land, Miller," he said, each word a chip of ice. "She is in my home, under my protection. You will not speak of her like that again. Now get off my property before I forget my Christian charity." Miller's grin vanished. He saw the look in Silas's eyes, a look that promised violence without hesitation. He'd seen that look in men pushed too far. Without another word, he yanked on his reins, turned his horse, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Silas stood there for a long moment, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned and saw Alara standing by the cabin, a piece of wet laundry clutched in her hands, her face pale. She had heard everything. Their eyes met across the dusty yard. He had drawn a line in the sand, not just for Miller, but for himself. He had named his responsibility. He had called it protection. In her eyes, he saw the dawning realization that he meant it. The trip to town for supplies became a necessary evil they postponed as long as possible. When the flour sack was finally empty and the coffee tin held only dust, Silas knew they couldn't wait any longer. The thought of subjecting Alara to the town's prying eyes made his stomach clench. "You can stay here," he offered, his voice rougher than he intended. "I can manage." She was kneading dough for their evening bread, her hands dusted with the last of the flour. She stopped and looked at him, a resolute set to her small chin. "The list is long. You'll need help carrying it all." It was the first time she had countered one of his suggestions, the first time she had asserted a need to be included. She was right, of course. He couldn't afford to make 2 trips, and one would be too much for him to carry alone. "All right," he conceded. "But stay close." The town felt different with her by his side. Every glance felt like an accusation, every hushed conversation a judgment. As they walked toward the mercantile, he was acutely aware of the space between them, a gulf of propriety and unspoken things. He saw Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, pull her children closer as they passed, her lips pursed in disapproval. Inside the mercantile, the air grew thick with tension. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, greeted Silas with his usual curt nod, but his eyes slid past Alara as if she were a shadow. When Silas asked for a bolt of calico cloth, Henderson looked at him, then at Alara. "For her?" he asked, his tone implying Silas was buying finery for a horse. "For my household," Silas bit out, the words tasting like ash. Alara, who had been standing silently by the counter, spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "I need needles and thread as well, please." the strong kind, for denim. Henderson ignored her completely, turning back to Silas. Will that be all, Blackwood? The lady asked for needles and thread, Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. He leaned forward slightly on the counter. I suggest you get them for her. Henderson, startled by the steel in Silas's tone, flushed a deep red. He scurried to a drawer, pulled out a small packet of needles and a spool of thread, and slapped them on the counter without a word. Alara placed the coins Silas had given her into his hand, her fingers brushing his for a brief moment. The contact was like a spark on dry tinder. Henderson snatched the coins away. The ride home was steeped in a heavy, oppressive silence. The fragile peace they had built on the isolated ranch had been shattered by the casual cruelty of the town. He could feel her retreat, pulling back into the protective shell he'd first seen at the auction. He had tried to protect her, but he couldn't shield her from the poison of other people's minds. Back at the cabin, she moved with a brittle quietness, putting the supplies away with jerky, efficient movements. He watched her, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He had made her a target for scorn, a subject of gossip. He had saved her from one kind of cage only to lock her in another. That evening, the distance between them at the dinner table felt like a mile. He knew he should say something, but the words wouldn't come. As she rose to clear the plates, her hand brushed a tin cup, sending it clattering to the floor. She flinched violently, a choked gasp escaping her lips, and cowered as if expecting a blow. In that instant, Silas saw not the competent young woman who ran his household, but the terrified girl who had lived under Jedediah Thorne's brutal thumb. The reflexive terror in her posture told a story of past cruelties more eloquently than words ever could. Alara, he said, his voice gentle. She wouldn't look at him, her shoulders hunched. I'm sorry. It was clumsy. I'll be more careful. It's just a cup, he said softly. He stood up and walked around the table. He knelt, picked up the cup, and placed it back on the table. He stayed there for a moment, level with her, so he wouldn't tower over her. No one is going to strike you in this house. Ever. I swear it on my wife's grave. Slowly, she raised her head. Her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. She saw the absolute sincerity in his face, the raw pain in his expression as he mentioned his wife. It was a vow made on the most sacred thing he had. She gave a single, shaky nod. The wall of fear between them had just developed its first real crack. He had offered her more than protection. He had offered her peace. And in that moment, she began to dare to hope it was real. The first snow of winter arrived early, a soft, silent blanket that transformed the harsh landscape into something beautiful and isolating. It cut them off from the town, from the judging eyes and whispered condemnations. Within the snow globe world of the ranch, the fragile shoots of trust between Silas and Alara began to grow. The shared work of survival forged a bond stronger than words. They spent evenings by the fire, he repairing harnesses while she read aloud from the Bible, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each chapter. The stories of hardship and deliverance resonated deeply in the quiet cabin. One morning, Silas awoke to a world gone white, the wind howling a mournful song around the eaves of the cabin. A blizzard had descended during the night, burying the world in a deep drift of snow. His first thought was of the livestock. He pulled on his heaviest coat and boots, breaking a trail through the chest-deep snow to the barn. The chickens were huddled together for warmth, and his old mare, Bess, whinnied softly in greeting. But one of the walls of the lean-to where he stored his hay had buckled under the weight of the snow, leaving a gaping hole. He spent the entire day fighting the storm, trying to shore up the wall with frozen timber and numb fingers. The wind tore at him, driving ice crystals into his skin. By the time he stumbled back into the cabin near dusk, he was shivering uncontrollably, his body racked with a deep, bone-aching cold. Alara took one look at him and flew into action. She helped him out of his frozen coat, her small hands surprisingly strong. She sat him in a chair by the fire and wrapped him in every blanket they owned. She chafed his hands and feet, her touch gentle but firm, trying to bring life back to his frozen extremities. She forced hot broth between his chattering teeth. Through the haze of his exhaustion and cold, he was aware of her constant presence, a warm, determined force pushing back against the chill that had seeped into his very marrow. He drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, and every time he woke, she was there, adding wood to the fire, or placing a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. He had been alone for so long, had faced every hardship by himself. The simple, profound act of being cared for was so foreign it felt like a dream. He awoke late the next day to sunlight streaming through the window. The storm had broken. He was tucked into his own bed, the cabin warm and quiet. Alara was sitting at the table, her head resting on her arms, asleep. She had watched over him all night. A deep, unfamiliar emotion washed over him. A fierce, protective tenderness that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the woman sleeping in the chair. He must have made a sound, because her head jerked up, her eyes wide and startled. "You're awake," she said, a wave of relief washing over her face. "Your fever broke." "You," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. "You stayed up." "You were ill," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I had to make sure the fire didn't go out." He knew it was more than that. He had seen the worry in her eyes. He had felt the care in her touch. She had fought for him, for his well-being, with the same quiet tenacity she applied to everything. He had bought her contract to save her from a life of misery. But in that long, cold night, she had, in her own way, saved him right back. The fragile peace of their snowbound world was shattered a week later by the arrival of a stranger. He was a tall man on a fine black horse, dressed in a city coat that looked out of place against the snow. He rode with an air of arrogant authority that set Silas's teeth on edge. The man dismounted and strode to the cabin door without waiting for an invitation. Alara, who was outside scattering feed for the chickens, froze when she saw him. The color drained from her face, and the small tin of feed slipped from her fingers, spilling across the snow. It was a terror Silas hadn't seen in her since the auction. "Alara, my dear," the man said, his voice a slick, oily thing. "You've been quite difficult to find, hiding out here in the wilderness." "What do you want?" Silas asked, stepping out of the cabin to stand between the man and Alara. The man's eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, flicked over Silas with disdain. "My name is Marcus Thorne," he announced. "Jedediah was my brother, and I've come to collect my property." He produced a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. "My brother's affairs were a mess. But this," he said, waving a document, "is perfectly clear. Your indenture contract. It was sold illegally at a dead auction. It belongs to me, as his sole heir. The girl is mine." Silas felt the blood run cold in his veins. He looked at Alara, who was trembling, her eyes fixed on Marcus Thorne with a look of pure, unadulterated fear. "That contract was burned," Silas said, his voice a low growl. Marcus Thorne laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Burning a copy doesn't invalidate the original filed with the territorial magistrate. I have it right here. The law is on my side. Now, I'm a reasonable man. I'll sell you the contract for, say, $200. A steep price, but she seems to have domesticated nicely." His eyes roved over Alara in a way that made Silas's hands curl into fists. $200. He might as well have asked for the moon. Silas had less than $5 to his name. "She's not for sale," Silas said. "She's not yours to sell," Thorne countered smoothly. "I'll give you until sundown tomorrow to come up with the money. If you don't, I'll be back with Sheriff Brody. He's an old friend of the family. We'll take her by force if necessary. And you, my good man, will be arrested for theft of property." He tipped his hat, a mocking gesture of civility, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a chilling silence in his wake. Alara finally crumpled, her legs giving out. Silas caught her, holding her upright. She was shaking so badly he could feel it through his thick coat. "He's worse than Jedediah," she whispered, her voice ragged with terror. "He's clever and cruel." Silas led her inside and sat her by the fire. The sanctuary he had built for them had been breached. The outside world, with its cruel laws and crueler men, had come crashing in. He looked at her, at the absolute despair on her face, and knew he would not, could not, let this man take her. That night, the pretense of their arrangement finally dissolved. Fear stripped them down to the raw truth of their situation. Alara was pacing the small cabin like a caged animal. "I can run," she said, her voice frantic. "I can head for the mountains. He'll never find me. And freeze or starve to death." Silas countered, his own fear making his voice harsh. He stood up and took her by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. You are not running. This is your home now." The words came out before he had time to think about them, but he knew they were true. This lonely cabin had become a home because she was in it. He would not let it be emptied again. "He has the law on his side," she sobbed, the fight finally going out of her. "There's nothing we can do." "The law," Silas said, a desperate idea beginning to form in his mind, "is a complicated thing. It respects certain bonds above others." He looked at her, at the firelight dancing in her tear-filled eyes. He was about to risk everything, not just for her safety, but for the life they had begun to build. "There's one contract that supersedes an indenture," he said, his voice quiet but steady. He took a deep breath. "A marriage certificate." Alara stared at him, her mouth falling open. The tears on her cheeks seemed to freeze. "Marry you. It's the only way," he said, laying out the desperate logic. "As your husband, I'd be your legal guardian. Thorn's claim would be void. The law would have to recognize it. It wouldn't be real," he added quickly, seeing the shock on her face. "It would be for protection. A piece of paper. To keep you safe." He was offering her a new kind of bondage to save her from the old one. A life sentence with him to protect her from Thorn. He watched her, his heart pounding, waiting for her answer. She looked around the small, warm cabin, at the mended shirt hanging by the hearth, at the book she'd been reading, at the man standing before her whose quiet strength was the only shield she had ever known. She thought of Marcus Thorne's cold eyes and the life of horror that awaited her. Then she looked at Silas, who had defended her, cared for her, and treated her with a dignity she'd never known. She straightened her shoulders, wiping the tears from her face with the back of her hand. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. "When do we leave?" They rode for Redemption Gulch at first light, the world still gray and frozen. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Neither of them spoke. The magnitude of what they were about to do sat between them, a vast, uncharted territory. This was not a ride of hope and love, but a grim march to battle, with a preacher's parlor as their chosen ground. As they neared the town, they saw them. Marcus Thorne and Sheriff Brody, a stout man with a drooping mustache, were standing on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, waiting. Thorne had a smug, confident look on his face. He expected them to come begging, or to have the girl in tow, ready for surrender. He saw them approach, and his smug look widened into a triumphant grin. He stepped into the street to block their path, Sheriff Brody following a pace behind. Well, Blackwood," Thorne called out, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "Have you come to your senses? I'll take payment now, if you have it. If not, just hand over the girl, and we can avoid any unpleasantness." A few early risers, sensing a confrontation, stopped to watch. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. The town was becoming their audience. Alara shrank back in her saddle, the old fear clawing at her. Silas reined Bess to a halt and dismounted. He moved to Alara's side and helped her down, his hand lingering on her arm for a moment, a silent message of support. He stood in front of her, a solid, unmoving shield. "She's not going anywhere with you, Thorne," Silas said, his voice flat and hard. Thorne laughed. "Brave words. Sheriff, I believe this man is in possession of my stolen property. I wish to press charges." Sheriff Brody shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Now, Silas, let's be reasonable." "I am being reasonable," Silas cut in. He looked past Thorne, his eyes locking on the figure of Preacher Gable, who had heard the commotion and was now standing on the porch of his small white church at the end of the street. "Preacher," Silas's voice boomed, clear and strong, silencing the growing murmurs of the crowd. Every head turned. "Preacher, we have need of your services." Thorne's smile faltered, replaced by a look of confusion. "What trick is this, Blackwood?" Silas ignored him, his focus entirely on the preacher. "Alara and I have come to be married." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Thorne's face went from confusion to disbelief, then to pure, sputtering rage. Sheriff Brody's jaw dropped. "You can't do that," Thorne shrieked. "She's my property. Her contract is a civil matter," Silas shot back, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't known he possessed. "A marriage is a holy sacrament, a bond before God. Tell me, Sheriff, which law do you think holds more weight in this town?" He turned his gaze on the crowd. "This woman is not property. She is not a stray. She is not a contract. Her name is Alara, and she will be my wife." The final, crucial part of his plan, the part that was not a tactic but a truth, came to his lips. He turned to Alara, his expression softening, the entire world narrowing to the space between them. In front of the whole town, he laid his heart bare. "If you'll have me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond protection. This was her moment, her choice. All her life, choices had been made for her. Now, this man, this quiet, honorable rancher, was giving her the most important one of all. She saw the truth in his eyes, not pity, not duty, but a deep, abiding respect. A burgeoning affection she now recognized as a mirror of her own. She found her voice, a voice free from fear. She stepped out from behind his protection to stand beside him, an equal. She looked Marcus Thorne dead in the eye. "I am not your property," she said, her words a final, definitive severing of her past. Then she turned her radiant, tear-bright eyes to Silas. "I will," she said, her voice full of a feeling so powerful it left no room for doubt. "Yes, Silas, I will." A murmur of shock and grudging respect went through the crowd. Preacher Gable, a good man who had been troubled by the town's treatment of the girl, saw the righteous truth of the moment. He smiled, a rare and genuine thing. "The house of God is always open," he declared, his voice cutting through thorns and rage protests. He gestured to the church steps. "Let's not keep the Lord waiting." Marcus Thorne stood, defeated and humiliated, as Silas Blackwood took Alara's hand and led her up the steps of the church, the town of Redemption Gulch their unwilling witnesses. The promise made in desperation at an auction block was about to be reforged in the sacred light of a new dawn. The ride back to the ranch was a world away from the grim journey into town. A new silence enveloped them, but this one was not awkward or heavy. It was a space of quiet contemplation, filled with the enormity of the vows they had just spoken in the small, sunlit church. The marriage certificate, a simple piece of paper with the preacher's spidery script, was tucked safely in Silas's inner coat pocket. It felt heavier and more real than any deed or contract. When they reached the cabin, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the snow. The familiar landscape looked different, changed, just as they were. Silas helped her down from the mare, and for a moment, they just stood in the yard, the cabin before them no longer just his shelter that he shared, but their home. Inside, the air was still and warm from the morning's fire. The reality of their new situation settled around them. They were husband and wife. A farmer and his wife, standing in their kitchen. It was the most normal thing in the world, and yet the most extraordinary. Silas pulled the certificate from his pocket. He unfolded it carefully and held it out to her. "This is yours," he said, his voice earnest. "This is your protection. It means you are a free woman, Alara. You're beholden to no one. Not to Thorne. Not to me." He wanted to make it clear. The vow was a shield for her, not a chain. She took the paper, her fingers tracing her new name. Alara Blackwood. She looked up at him, her green eyes searching his. "And what does it mean for you, Silas?" He struggled for the words. "It means," the silence is gone. It was the simplest, most honest answer he could give. "It means I'm not alone." He started to gather his few personal belongings, a razor, a spare shirt, his wife's book of essays. "I'll move my things to the barn. You should have the cabin, the bed." "No," she said, her voice soft but firm. She stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. Her touch was warm, certain. "Don't." He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then up into her eyes. An entire conversation passed between them without a single word. "Don't go. Stay. This is our home now. Together." He slowly set his things back down. The decision was made. That evening, a profound peace settled over the small cabin. It was the peace of a battle won, of a sanctuary secured. They sat across from each other at the small wooden table, sharing a simple meal of bread and the last of the stew. The lantern on the table cast a warm, golden glow, pushing the shadows into the corners of the room. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw not the desperate, dirt-smudged girl from the auction, but a woman of incredible strength and quiet grace. A woman who had faced down a monster and chosen him. A woman who had filled his empty house and his even emptier life with a gentle, steady light. Her vow from that day, "I'll be yours eternal," echoed in his mind, but its meaning had been utterly transformed. It was no longer a promise of servitude, but a testament to a bond forged in hardship and sealed in defiance. She met his gaze, and a slow, genuine smile touched her lips, reaching her eyes and making them shine. And Silas, a man who had forgotten how, smiled back. He reached across the small table, his calloused, work-worn hand covering hers. She curled her fingers around his, her touch a silent promise. The contract was ash, the debt was paid, and what remained was something far more valuable than anything that could be bought or sold. It was a beginning. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.